All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's afternoon now. This is session 3 of a four-part session on capitalism and the free markets from a halachic perspective. In the first 2 weeks, just as a quick summary, because they really do build, although they all are each self-contained topics in terms of what we're addressing, they all work together in a larger whole in terms of coming up with a sort of economic theory or approach, if you will, that halacha tries to project. We noted in the first 2 sessions, in the first session more generally, and the second session more specifically, I'll get to that in just a moment, that halacha and kind of the Jewish perspective in general differs greatly from that of, on the one hand, Christianity, classical Christianity in general, the church fathers in particular in terms of some of their writings. There's kind of been this tendency throughout the ages to associate kind of Judaism equals socialism. That's kind of been a canard that's been almost peddled now for a long time. But as we've shown over the first couple of weeks, nothing really can be further from the truth. We spoke about, in the first week, we spoke about property rights, property ownership, the accumulation of wealth, as things which, although inherently sinful in Christianity, are things which are not at all inherently sinful at all, according to Judaism, and in fact, quite the opposite. Judaism views the accumulation of property, the accumulation of wealth, as either, at worst, a vehicle through which to, at best, an actualization of inherently my tselem Elokim, being created in the image of God. The idea that I can conquer, that I can accumulate, that I can almost dominate the world around me is something which mirrors, mirrors God. God is the one who creates. God is the one who accumulates. God is the one who owns, who dominates. And being created in Tselem Elokim is kind of mirroring that idea. We then segued into the second week to a in-depth discussion about the halachic approach to charity. Very often, the kind of smoking gun, to use that analogy, the smoking gun that's used to show that Judaism equals socialism is the idea that charitable giving in halacha is mandated. It's not an option. It's not a quote-unquote good deed when you give tzedakah. It's a mitzvah, just like any other mitzvah. Just like I have a mitzvah to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah and to shake a lulav on Sukkot and to eat matzah on Pesach and to put on tefillin every day, I have a mitzvah to give tzedakah. And when there's a poor person who needs something, I must provide for them. However, so at first glance, right, if you woke me up in the middle of the night and asked me, that sounds like redistribution, right? Which is, kind of classical, has the classical undertones of a socialistic type of redistributive justice, which many people kind of associate Judaism with. But as we pointed out, both in terms of how the Torah conveys the mitzvah of tzedakah, the context in which the Torah conveys the mitzvah of tzedakah, as well as some of the later authorities. In particular, we spent a lot of time last week discussing the Rambam, how the Rambam notes and kind of how where he puts it and how he discusses it and kind of some of the formulations that the Rambam uses, that actually tzedakah at its core is not a juridical mitzvah. In other words, by that we mean not a mitzvah which is meant to restore economic justice and equality, but rather tzedakah is a moral, religious requirement. By that we mean the reason why I have to give is not because I have and he doesn't and we have to level the playing field. That is not why I give. The reason why I give is because every Jew is my brother or sister, and when there is someone who isn't part of my family who is in need, I have to provide for them. It's not as if I'm here and they're here and we're kind of trying to almost balance the scales. No, as the Torah says, Ki lo yechdal avyon mikarav haaretz. The Torah says there will always be poor people. That's what the Torah says explicitly, as we noted last week. And that's not a promise as much as it is a commentary. It's not supposed to be that everyone has the same. That's what the Torah is telling us. But in light of the reality that there are always people who need, you have to be there for them. And we concluded last week with the concluding note of the Rambam in the laws of tzedakah. The last thing the Rambam says in the laws of tzedakah, and this kind of serves as a good segue to this week, the last thing the Rambam says is, what type of person is on the highest level possible? The highest level is not someone who gives a lot of tzedakah. The highest level is someone who needs tzedakah, but can get by without it, and perseveres, and doesn't take, even though they have a right to, they're able to get by without it because they don't want to burden the community. That's the person who's on the high. In other words, as if to say that really tzedakah in its entirety, really tzedakah as an institution, is about community. It's about drawing a circle around the entire community and saying, I'm responsible for my fellow Jew, I'm responsible for my family. It's not a juridical, economic justice, redistributive sort of institution, but a moral one. A moral person is someone who takes care of their brother or sister in need, which is why throughout the ages, societies, Jewish communities there has been a sense of coercion in the context of tzedakah. Communities have forced members of that community to give tzedakah, but we shouldn't take that to mean that because there is coercion, there was kind of forced giving. That doesn't mean that it's redistributive. That just means that society has a right to expect. There is an expectation in a halachic society that you live a moral life. Living a moral life means taking care of each other. And just as we would force you to do other things that make you a moral person, forcing you to give tzedakah is making you a moral person. The idea of coercion per se exists all throughout halacha, in all sorts of different contexts. So I can force you to do all sorts of mitzvot that we wouldn't necessarily have forced you to do. And this is another mitzvah that I'm forcing you to do because you have a religious, moral, legal obligation to take care of those around you. Yes?
My question is, without the temple, though, how does tzedakah relate to, say, the tithe that you would have had to give to the temple? Did that translate into something in non-temple times?
Mm-hmm. So it's not. I don't think the existence of the temple per se is what created this kind of communal structure. Even in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, there was that kind of communal authority, right? Even in Talmudic times, after the destruction of the temple.
But there was a tithe for the temple, which was, that was not tzedakah, that was law.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if did that get folded into tzedakah after the destruction of the temple?
The concept of tithing, as we also noted last week, the concept of tithing is something which is part and parcel of, the idea of charitable giving. But not every tithe that I took and subsequently gave was charitable in nature. In other words,
right.
So, but yeah, I think, I wouldn't say necessarily that it's spilled over, but I think that was the model that they kind of, right? Because I'm sure many of us are familiar with the notion that, we tithe our income, and the Meiser Ksafim, we separate a tenth of what we make and we give. So that's kind of a custom that's become, so it is the same model, even if not necessarily identical. We're going to focus this, yes?
Question. I thought, learning until now, but now there's a chiddush, and I find it very interesting. That's why I'm making the comment that Rambam's highest level of tzedakah was when I tried to help my fellow in need become self-sufficient.
Correct.
So now as a chiddush, you're pointing out that I, as the person in need, have a responsibility to not to force or to even inspire my co-religionists to help me.
Right,
Which
absolutely.
I find very, very interesting.
Absolutely.
I'm taking a course elsewhere on the history of New York, and we're reading a book called Ragged Dick. I don't know if anybody has read it. It's about poverty in New York and how the poor people in the mid-19th century were really scored. They thought it was like a sin to be poor. So, but
sure.
And that's a Christian kind of thinking. So now you were saying that we're differentiating ourselves from the Christians, but this aspect about the responsibility of the poor person to outgrow his poverty is
sure. That's so Judaism. That has very strong roots in Judaism. The idea that poverty, being poor, should be avoided at all costs. There's a very famous comment by Chazal, "Ani chashuv k'meis," right? In the context of Yaakov Avinu, when the Midrash says, this is just one example of it. The Midrash says that Esav sent his son Eliphaz to go kill Yaakov, right? And Eliphaz comes to Yaakov, Esav's oldest son Eliphaz, comes to Yaakov, and he says, oh, Uncle Yaakov, what am I supposed to do? I have to listen to my father because he said to kill you, but I don't want to kill you. You're a good person. So Yaakov says, what does he say to him? Anyone familiar with this Midrash? You might have learned it when we were little kids. So he says, take all my money, because ani chashiv kames, right? If you don't have anything, it's as if you're dead. So obviously not literally, but the symbolism is there. That and so Yaakov arrives, with nothing. So there is that has strong roots. We noted. We're not going to rehash everything we discussed, but it's certainly the case that the Rambam, in discussing the laws of poverty, the laws of charity, focuses almost, except for this last line, focuses almost solely on the giver. The reason why I have to give tzedakah is not because that person deserves it, right? The reason why I have to give tzedakah is because I'm a moral person, and when there's someone in need, I have to give, right? So that's kind of the focus, which we discussed and we elaborated on last week. What I'd like to delve into a little bit this week is, in the time remaining, is the question, the specific question of free market and economy. I think we live in the United States in the year 2016. Not only that, but we live in New York, and the idea that opening up a business, or the idea that I would be kind of purging your customers would be problematic is just not a concept that we're familiar with. There's a pizza shop on every block. There's a kosher pizza shop on every block. Obviously in some places more concentrated than others. But we live in a society that almost doesn't subscribe to, survival of the fittest, capitalism, instinctively we don't think of taking someone else's customers as a form of theft. It's just not something we don't think of it that way. So if there's a mom and pop shop on the corner, and then a Target or Costco opens up 3 blocks away, right? And the mom and pop shop 3 months later is out of business. So we don't think of that as problematic or, society certainly doesn't view that as illegal in any way. The question is, from a halachic perspective, what does halacha have to say about those sorts of questions? And I think what we're going to see, what I'd like to develop today in the time that we have, is halacha really does seek to strike a balance between, on the one hand, kindness, sensitivity. Again, we're going to use that word. We keep on using it. Morality, right? Morality, decency, and kind of interconnectedness. We draw a circle around the entire halachic community, the entire Jewish community, on the one hand, but on the other hand, the kind of the validation, the legitimization of making a living, and every individual's rights to kind of have that opportunity as well. So just as as a starting point, if you take a look at the first source on the page, there are actually 2 introductory sources before we get to source number 1 on the page. And this is a Mishnah from Masechet Bava Metzia, and the Mishnah is discussing, for lack of a better title or slogan, I guess, and you're going to see that, no pun intended, you'll see in just a second. The slogan of this Mishnah really is advertising. Are you allowed to advertise in halacha? And the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo yechalek hachenvani klayot ve'egozin latinokot mipnei shehu margilan lavo etzlo. One is not permitted to give candies or nuts or treats as a shopkeeper. A shopkeeper is not permitted to hand out sweets or treats to little children, because why? That will convince them to go there, right? And that apparently is problematic, okay? I'm not advertising my product in any way, right? It's nothing having to do with my product. It's just to get people through the door. I'm giving people candy just so they come through the door. Says Rabbi Yehuda, that is problematic. V'chachamim, and we actually, halacha is like the chachamim here. V'chachamim matirim. Chachamim say it's okay. When you go to I can't go anywhere now without the shopkeeper giving my child a lollipop. I go to the cleaners, I go to the barber shop, I go to the the dentist, right? The bank, the bank. I forgot them. Cleaners, barber shop, and bank. I think are the three. Wherever they're always giving my children lollipops. Why are they giving my children lollipops? So I should go to the bank. I should go to that barber shop. Okay? Because they know that if I have a choice to go to this barbershop or the barbershop down the block, the fact that my kid can get a lollipop at that barbershop is going to convince me to go there. So that's a subject of dispute between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, whether that's ethical. Is that an ethical sort of thing? This is not a comment on any particular qualitative aspect of my business or the products that I'm trying to sell, but is that ethical? Is that okay? Chachamim say it is, right? Why would you think the Chachamim say it is?
Because we like kids.
Well, of course we like kids.
Keep them happy.
Well, we hold like the Chachamim. Why is that considered ethical?
Because at the end of the day, you're offering a better product because you're offering a better experience.
Okay, but aren't I still purging customers from the other store?
They could give it all.
Excellent. That's exactly what the Gemara says. The Gemara, commenting on this Mishnah, says the reason why the Chachamim say it's okay is because I'll give out nuts in my store, you give out nuts in your store. The Gemara uses that exact language, right? I give out nuts in my store, you give out nuts. I'm not doing anything that is per se purging their customers. This is the kind of advertising free market principle, so long as there's a level playing field, right, that halacha does not look askance upon. Okay? The next issue in the Mishnah is a little bit more acute. Let's take a look. V'lo yivchos es hashar, and that, right, price gouging. Okay? You're not allowed to artificially manipulate the price of something and make it too low. Okay? The Chachamim omrim zachur latov. All right, another machlokas here. The first opinion in the Mishnah says you're not allowed to make the price so low so as to eliminate the competition. And the Chachamim say, right, zachur latov. Okay? Wonderful. You're remembered for good if you do that. So you kind of see this like tug in both directions, right? Am I allowed to lower the price? So the Rabbi Yehuda says, what? If I lower the price, what's going to happen? I'm going to put my competitor out of business. What do the Chachamim say?
You should do it.
I lower his. It's free market. If I lower my price, he should lower his price, right? And that's kind of zachar latov. Wonderful. What's wrong with low prices? Okay. And then the final issue, which also gets to a very specific point, and that's the machlokas in Abba Shaul, the comment of Abba Shaul, I should say. Lo yavor tagrisin divrei Abba Shaul. According to the opinion of Abba Shaul, a shopkeeper shouldn't sift the beans. All right, shouldn't get rid of the drek in the beans. Okay. The Chachamim matirin. The Chachamim allow you to do that. Why do you think Abba Shaul says you're not allowed to do that? So the Gemara says, "Umodim shlo yover mi'al pi hamagura she'eno ela kegone v'sa'ayin." Right. So even the Chachamim who allow it agree that you shouldn't sift just the top layer, because what are you doing then if you do that? You're gonei, right, very interesting language of the Mishnah. Gonei vet ha'ayin. What does that mean? You're stealing the eye, right? It's nothing but deception, right? Think about we've all experienced this. You go into a store and the front layer of something is pristine and beautiful, right? It's like state of the art. Then you like pull that one away and you see like the one behind it, and it's like rotten and dirty. And it's like, so it's putting on a good show. So when you sift only the top layer of beans, oh, this is a clean product, right? But the thing underneath is all dirty, right? So the question is, to what extent am I allowed to project a certain image of my product without it kind of being the reality? So that's kind of another these three very interesting, very pertinent issues that the Mishnah discusses in terms of free market principles. How much do we subscribe to and how much not? But even the Chachamim who agree that you're allowed to sift the beans to kind of make the product look, of higher quality, even they who agree say you shouldn't do so in a way that's deceptive. So there's no room for deception. And that kind of gets us into the core of the issue of Hasagas Gvul, of being Yored L'umnos Chavero. What extent to what extent do we allow economic competition? Do we allow the free market to play out? To what extent do we not allow it? Right? If I own a pizza shop on the corner, is there any limitation as to what the pizza shop down the block can do? Or who's allowed to open that pizza shop? Those are the sorts of questions that is discussed in the halacha. We should also, in that context, let's just learn the next introductory source in the Mishnah in Bava Basra. The Mishnah in Bava Basra deals with the question of literally opening shops. Lo yiftach adam chanut shel nachtomin v'shel tzva'in tachat otzaro shel chaveiro. Okay, you can't establish a shop in a courtyard which is right next to that of their friend. V'lo refes bakar v'amas b'yayin be'emes b'yayin hitiro. We're getting to all the details about all these cases, but basically, if you do that, if you want to open a shop in a courtyard, you can protest against him and say, I can't sleep. This is the Mishnah, which kind of serves as the springboard for the discussion of economic competition. This isn't the case per se, just as an introduction. The Bava Basra, we know, the Masechet Bava Basra is talking about damages. And it's talking about Hezek Re'iyah. It's talking about where I'm damaging to you not physically, but in other ways. So I'm not allowed to open a shop in a residential area and be making so much noise. So the person could say, you can't open the shop here. It's making too much noise. So what are the limitations of that? That's kind of where the Mishnah goes, and then the Gemara gets into the discussion. So with that as a context, let's look at the pasuk in the Torah, which really serves as the kind of ground zero, if you will, for this discussion. And that is the prohibition of hasagas gvul. Source number 1 on the page. Go ahead.
Translate, please. What is the hasagas? Is the shogash of hasagas lahasig?
Lahasig, well, with the samich, okay, which means to breach or to move, okay. As Rashi on the pasuk says, from the nasogu achor, to like move back, okay. So lo tasig gevul re'acha asher gavlu rishonim. You should not remove your neighbor's gevul, landmark, boundary, okay, when he put it up there first. When you get into Eretz Yisrael. Very interesting. It's beyond the scope of our discussion here. Why the Torah chose to phrase this as just the prohibition that exists in Israel. What about everywhere else, right? So it's kind of a interesting question. Does this prohibition not exist in Riverdale or New Rochelle or Englewood or wherever we happen to live?
Maybe only among Jews?
So, as we're going to see, that's an interesting question. As we're going to see, that gets to a much larger issue, which is, why do we even need this prohibition? Because it already says in the Torah, what? Don't steal, right? You're not allowed to steal. So, isn't this stealing? Why do I need this explicitly mentioned in the Torah? It actually mentions it one more time in the context of the Tochacha, the admonition that God offers in Parshat Kitavo, in Deuteronomy chapter 27. The second source in source number 1, Arur Masig Gvul Reyehu v'Amar Kol Ha'am Amen. Right? Cursed be the one who breaches, who removes their friend's boundary, and everyone said Amen. Okay? So, cursed be that person. Now, to the question of why we even need this, after all, isn't there a prohibition to steal? Rashi, in his commentary on the pasuk, actually addresses that question. Right? Rashi, lo tasid, source number 2. Rashi, lo tasig gevul, lashon nasogu achor, right, from the pasuk in Yeshayahu. Shemachzir siman chalukat karka la'achor, letoch sadei chavero, laman harchiv et shelo. What are you doing when you do this? I take the fence, right, what are the people who come in? The surveyors, right, who come and they tell you where your property line ends. They put up the fence. You come and you take that and you move it so that your property is larger and your neighbor's property is smaller. That is this prohibition. Asks Rashi, V'alo kvar nemar lo tigzol. Doesn't it already explicitly say you're not allowed to steal? Ma tamud lomar lo tasig. Why do I need this prohibition at all? Lamad al ha'oker tchum chaveiro she'over b'shnei lavin. Okay? What does this teach me? That someone who uproots the boundary, the border of their friend, actually just violates 2 prohibitions. right? You violate theft, and you violate this. Yeah?
Moving the boundary is different from theft. I mean,
Okay.
theft, you take something and you put it in, and it's obvious that a man is missing it. If you move the boundary, it might not be aware to the guy that you moved it. It's like a subtle form of
That's why.
of
I
theft,
think
yeah.
he was
And
aware.
it's not obvious. You might have to hire a surveyor to prove he moved it. I mean, it's not the same as theft. It's
Okay.
it's
So
really a different animal, so to speak.
So we haven't. You're right. We certainly could explain why it's different. What we would need to, I think, elaborate, be a little bit more precise as to why it's different. I think what you have in theft that you don't have here, if we want to kind of give the baby a name, be a little more precise. I think that what we have in theft that we might not necessarily have here is an action. You're not really, quote unquote, doing an act of theft when I move a fence. I'm moving a fence. I'm not stealing anything. So the question that we would have to ask if we had a little bit more time is, what are the mechanics of the prohibition of theft? Like, how much must I do? Do I even have to do anything, right? Let's say with the push of a couple of buttons, I'm able to steal money from your bank account and put it into my own, right? I haven't, quote unquote, stolen anything. I'm just pushing some buttons. So it's a fair question, right? So be that as it may, whenever you see, and this concept appears a lot, lavor alav b'shnei lavin, that sometimes the Torah gives a prohibition just to say that you're not only violating that prohibition, you're violating this prohibition as well. What does that mean? Why? Do we care how many prohibitions we're piling on? I mean, does that really matter? Why isn't it enough to say that when I move a boundary, I'm violating the prohibition of theft, I have to violate this one too? Is it a severity, stringency sort of thing? Or is it, yeah?
It seems to me it's probably because it was happening all the time. And so, I mean, I think a lot of laws are because it was happening and people obviously did not think of it as theft.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that that's why you would have to have a separate prohibition saying, you can't do it.
Okay, so.
It just sounds like it was happening all the
Right,
time.
okay.
Another idea is that it would seem like you would need this whole concept of lo tasi gavul, following the whole concept of that it's your nachala.
Yeah.
Because if it's your nachala, the land of Israel, God gave it to the Jewish people. I'm Jewish. I can have however much I have, but only with the additional sub-law of the lo tasi gavul is saying that yes, even though I'm Jewish and it is my inheritance, I have, certain
Right.
borders that I have to call mine within the greater inheritance.
Right. So that could be two. I think both those points are good. I think that the general question is whenever you have lav or olav b'shnei lavin, which is it's a very ubiquitous concept. It comes up a lot. Whenever you have that, the question you have to ask is, what's going on here? Is the Torah are they really identical? And the Torah is really just trying to pile on? Or is the Torah actually saying there are two different triggers, two different fundamental prohibitions here? And the question that we would have to ask ourselves, if that's the case, not only am I stealing, but I'm doing this. What else am I doing? What's the problem here? What hasagas gvul?
Deceiving.
Deception, right? Deception. And the fact that it could be the lav or olav b'shnei lavin point, that it's not just that you're stealing, you're also a jerk, right? You're not being a nice person. You're not being a moral person. So if that's the case, what that does for us is it opens the door to include many more types of things in this prohibition. When I take what's rightfully yours, whether it can be included in the concept of theft or not, I'm not being a good person, I'm not being a nice person. I'm taking what is yours. That we could perhaps bring under the umbrella of hasagas gvul. And that is exactly how I think we arrive at some of the sources which clearly indicate that when I am what halacha calls yored le'umnos chavero, which literally translates as I dip into the livelihood of my friend.
What is umnus?
Umnut means livelihood, craftsmanship. An uman is a craftsman. Umnut means a profession. Okay, Aleph vav mem nun vav taf. Okay, so yored lumnas chavera. I'm dipping into the profession of my friend. Where does that prohibition exist? So, just as an example, so the Maharshal, Rav Shlomo Luria, in source number 3, points out we're not going to get into the weeds too much, because if we were learning the sugya in greater depth, each of these pieces coming together would be super important. But as far as our larger kind of picture of capitalism and the open market from a halachic perspective, we'll just note what his conclusion is. He basically says the fact that there are 2 psukim, arur masig gvul reyehu ve'amar kol ha'am amen, as well as lo tasig gvul re'acha asher gavlu rishonim, all right, kind of leads me to believe that they can't be talking about the same thing, right? They're both in Devarim even. They're quite near each other. So what's going on here? Ela nira be'inai, he says in the last line. Ela nira be'inai. We see from here that what? Shekach hu mikubal mirabosav. De arur masig gvul reyehu. Bala harbot hasagat gvul shel masa umatan. What's being referred to here is hasagas gvul of masa umatan. What's masa umatan? Business, right? Masa umatan, really like it's the term used in halacha for giving and taking, right? Masa umatan, like interaction, but it's a term used in Hebrew very often to mean business interactions, right? Hasagas gvul also is a prohibition of hasagas gvul in business, of yored l'umnas chavero, and according to the Marshal, that's exactly what it's referring to. To be sure, the Chassam Sofer cites the Ramah, who says yored l'umnuso l'chora nira kol anogea be'inyan ze asur midoraita vegezel gomer hu min Torah. So according to the Chassam Sofer, citing other sources, you don't even need hasagas gvul, it's actual gezel. If you have customers that I steal from you, right, I'm actually stealing from you. That is not hasagas gvul, that's theft, that's gezela. So whether you subscribe to one or subscribe to the other, I think just my instinct is that I'm not doing an overt act of theft when I do that, although we're going to see in just a second the Gemara, that some of the cases discussed in the Gemara are really quite fascinating. But either way, certainly from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective, hasagas gvul kind of casts a shadow on all sorts of different types of practices, right? Already we're beginning to see in our discussion, the idea that halacha really does aim to strike a balance. On the one hand, we're not going to encumber you too greatly. We're not going to say that you can advertise your products. We're not going to say that you can't open a business, right? But on the other hand, you have to be a good person, right? Hasagas gvul, right? Know what your boundaries are, and we kind of have to figure out what are those boundaries. But whatever they are, know what they are and keep to them. Don't be a bad person, right? Be an ethical person, be a good person. Again, in line with the general theory that we've been developing over the last couple of weeks of it's not as much that I'm necessarily stealing from you and not giving you what belongs to you, but I have a responsibility to be an ethical person, to be a moral person. So that brings certain responsibilities and obligations with it. So, and I think in that context, it actually makes a lot of sense, some of the cases that are mentioned in the Gemara. We noted the Mishnah Bava Basra before. Any questions before we continue? Any comments?
I have a question. The notion of hasagat gvul basically really only starts with neighbors, right? So I just, there's a big leap I find, or maybe I'm missing something from this notion to business. And gouging each other's customer could be some sort of hasagat gvul, but then, I mean, if customers in general is a zero-sum game, right?
Yeah.
There's only a certain number of customers, and you want to be in business, where do you draw the line? I guess that is the
Right. So that's a fair question, and it's actually from two perspectives. Because as we're going to see, one of the determining factors whether I'm allowed to open a store next to you is whether we're both living in this neighborhood, right? If you live in this neighborhood and I live in this neighborhood, we may both have a right to the same pool of customers. What's really problematic, the halacha is going to point out, is when people from outside, when the corporate bigwigs that are, sitting in some office building somewhere, decide that it's a good idea to open a store right here on Riverdale Avenue next to the mom and pop shop who lives literally down the block, right? So where you live and who your neighbors are actually does matter. We're going to see that in just a second. The other point that I would say is, well, what was the other point I was going to say? I got so into that point, I forgot about what the second point was. It'll come to me. So I had something else to say in response to that. But the Gemara actually, as using that mission as the mission about Hezek Re'iyah, about making too much noise, as a springboard, the Gemara does discuss very similar types of cases. So Rav Huna, and the source number 5 now, Rav Huna actually says, Hi bar mavua de'uki rechaya. If a member of a mavui, are we familiar with what a mavui is? Anyone ever heard that term before? A mavui is an alleyway, often closed on 3 sides and open on the 4th. That's often what a mavui was. The way people used to reside, the way people used to live, is there was like an open alleyway, and off of the alleyways were courtyards, and each courtyard had maybe a couple of homes. So a mavui was kind of like a main thoroughfare where everyone would kind of come into. So says Rav Huna, Hi bar mavua de'uki rechaya. If a member of a mavui set up a mill, the asa bar mavua chavre the kamuki gabe, and someone from another mavui comes in and tries, someone from that mavui comes, his friend from that mavui comes in and also tries to set up a mill, right? He can prevent him from doing so, right? Dinahu dima'akevi lave. He can stop him from doing so. Why? De'omarle, because he can say to him, Kapasakta lichyusi. You are stopping, like from posek, to stop, okay? You are preventing, you are infringing upon my livelihood, right? He could say that, right? That's what Rav Huna says. Now, when you hear that, it sounds a lot like we're limiting economic competition. But what you always have to do, not just in halacha, in any legal system, when you have a rule, a law, a statute like this, you have to figure out what are the circumstances. Maybe it's specifically a mill. Maybe it's specifically a mavui. What is it about this scenario that caused Rav Huna to say this? And the Gemara is going to dig in and try and figure out what the halacha would be. Okay, so you're stopping my livelihood. Says the Gemara, lema messiah. Maybe we actually have a support for Rav Huna from the following halacha. Marchikim mitzudad hadag min hadag kimale ritzat hadag. Okay? Another law has it that if I'm setting up a fish net, now some of the commentaries here argue as to exactly what the case is and what is being prohibited. But we'll just subscribe to one, for the sake of clarity, we'll just subscribe to one of the views and I'll explain it in that way. Marchikim mitzudad hadag min hadag kimale ritzat hadag. If I'm a fisherman, I'm setting up a fish net in the water. Now, obviously, we're talking about water. We're more likely talking about public space. We're not talking about an area that is rightfully mine, like a mavui, right? But if I'm a fisherman and I'm setting up a fish net in a public space, okay, and you want to set up a fish net as well in the public space, you have to distance your fish net from my fish net. How far? The amount of space that a fish would normally swim. Okay? So I have a right to the fish in my area. You want to set up a fish net? You go somewhere else. You catch a different area of fish. Okay? The same fish, it's difficult to speak this way about a fish that's about to be caught and died, but the same fish can't compete for 2 different fish nets, if you will. Okay? So the suggestion of the Gemara here is maybe Rav Huna's halacha is actually in line with this halacha, right? Maybe this halacha of not setting up a fish net to steal from another fish net is a good support for Rav Huna's assertion that one member of a mavui can't set up a grinding mill next to another member of a mavui. That's what the Gemara suggests. But the Gemara rejects that comparison. Why is that not a good comparison? And again, here we're already seeing some of the factors of differentiation. Why is it that some scenarios are different than others? Says the Gemara, Shiny dogim diahave siara. Fish are different. Why? Because you put out fish bait. You put out food. Okay? Now, I see I left that sentence incomplete. I apologize. But why is it problematic? Because I'm not just setting up a fish net. What am I doing? You're luring the fish away by putting out bait. That's one opinion. The other opinion that says that the person who's being referred to that's putting out the food is the first guy, that you're actually stealing from him because he puts out the food. Let's explain it that way. I think that way is a little bit smoother, right? When I put fish bait out into my fish net, I am proactively taking fish out of his fish net. I'm being deceptive. Okay, I'm purging his customers in a way that I wouldn't be doing if I just didn't do that. So what's the difference between, again, so now translating into modern times, right? Halacha appears to be saying there is a difference between opening a store down the block from another store, on the one hand, and opening up a store down the block from the other store and doing things to actively take customers away from that store, okay? Now again, from a strictly legal perspective, okay? From a strictly monetary, financial, economic perspective, is there really a difference between those two things? How so?
One is passive and one is
From a strictly monetary, economic perspective.
yes, because if you're aggressive in looking for customers, it does not even out equally.
Right, but so I guess what the following two scenarios. From a financial perspective, is there a difference between these two scenarios? Sal's Pizza Shop used to gross $100 a day. Okay, now I opened up my store. Now he grosses $80 a day. Okay, or Sal's Pizza Shop used to gross $100 a day. I opened up my store and put up a sign that says, "Don't go to Sal's. He has rats in his store." Okay, and Sal now grosses $80 a day. Okay, I'm stealing the same $20 from him. From an economic, financial perspective, I'm stealing the same $20 from him. Where does the difference lie?
There's no difference.
Where does the not in from an morally there's a difference, right? The halacha I think here is drawing a moral distinction. Morally, ethically, there's a difference between whether I lure customers with bait away from, here we're talking about fish, not people, but I lure customers away from his store actively by putting out bait, okay, or not. So, per se, the notion of opening, I think from this Gemara we see already, the notion of opening up a store, and I see already we're not going to be able to cover everything, but the idea, just this, I think this little kernel is even enough to be able to come away with something. That halacha is very particular. That the notion, the idea of per se opening up a store in an area where there is another store is something which is, in a vacuum, not necessarily problematic. That's not quote unquote hasagas gvul, right? That's not being a jerk. But you're not allowed to be a jerk, right? You're not allowed to actively purge someone else's customers by putting out bait. From a theft perspective, again, neither of those things, just to get back to our conversation before, neither of those things is an act of theft, right? Whether you're putting out bait or not. But one is ethical and one is not. Yeah.
What's the difference between that and the example of the lollipops? Because you could say, okay, you open your pizza shop and you say, come to my pizza shop because it's really the best pizza.
Yep.
And so Sal could do that too.
Absolutely.
So isn't it similar to the lollipop situation?
So it is. It could be. And I think if that is in fact the case, that possibility really does exist, then maybe that would be true. There's one more. It's an incomplete picture because there's one more limiting factor that I'd like to talk about that will kind of, I think, complete the circle. If it's the case that, and again, like you said, we paskin like the Chachamim, who says that you're allowed to do that, you're allowed to advertise. So under what circumstances the bait that I put out would be problematic is a fair and legitimate question. But if I can legitimately prove that I am actually purging your customers, right, then that's the unethical piece. And it's hard to do that. But from a theoretical perspective, the distinction the Gemara is drawing here, I think, is that distinction. To close the circle, and we'll end off with this, and again, I wish we had time to go into more of the practical cases. Maybe we'll begin next week a little bit on this, and then we'll continue with our last session, which is I want to talk a little bit about healthcare. That's what we're going to do next week, how halacha views the distribution or the providing of health benefits to society. The very loaded question, is healthcare a right? Is it a privilege? Right? All those sorts of questions I want to talk a little bit about next week. But I want to finish with a psak that came from the Ashkenazi halachic world in source number 6b, the second 6. Okay? And this is from the Hagos Maimonios. The Hagos Maimonios is a commentary on the Rambam. Again, feel free to peruse some of the other sources. The rest of the Gemara in Bava Basra in source number 5 and the Shulchan Aruch in source number 6. The translation is not there, but a good translation of the Shulchan Aruch is available via online or any good Jewish bookstore has, or the bookstore in the library in your shul, I'm sure has it. Feel free. Choshen Mishpah Kuf Nun Vav Sif Hey provides a lot of practical applications of some of the concepts that are laid out in that Gemara. Source number 6 actually addresses or puts like a more fine, more acute spin on some of the things we've been talking about. Mavui hasatum begimel tzdadim. Okay, if you have a mavui, an alleyway that is closed on 3 sides. Now, if it's closed on 3 sides, what does that mean? In terms of egress and regress.
People have to.
One way in.
There's only one way in, one way out. Okay? Umavui hasasam begimel tzdadim. Uvetzad echad rak nichnasim lo. Right? And there is, you go in, you can only go in on one side. Vidar Ruvain eitzel sofo hasasum. Ruvain, where does he live? By living here, we don't mean necessarily where he puts his head down at night. Where he lives and he runs his business. Okay? Where does Ruvain live? At the end of the alleyway. By the closed end of the alleyway. At the end. Okay? Uba Shimon ladur klapei tzad hapetach. Okay? She'ein nachriya cholelech im lo yelech tchila lifnei pesach Shimon nira dema Akiva leh kiravuna. All right? Whereas normally it's not a problem to open up 2 stores near each other. What is problematic? It's problematic if you have a 3-way alleyway, okay? And Ruvain lives over here, and he has his business over here, and Shimon comes and does what? Opens a business right here, so that you have to pass his store to get to this store, okay? Nira dima akev. Says the Hagos Maimonios, this guy, who was there first and who's been there, has a right to be ma'akev, to push out this guy, right? Why? Because that's overt hasagas gvul, right? Similar to uki recha, what's the language of the Gemara? Yahavi siyara, right? You're literally being a bad guy by doing that, right? You're almost, whether directly or indirectly, you're saying, what are you going there for? Just come to me, right? Now, modern thoroughfares, this particular limitation isn't as much of a problem because there are very few areas where you have to pass one store to get to another, right? We don't really live in places like that anymore.
Yeah, we don't have alleyways.
But we appreciate the sentiment. And the sentiment is that even if under the right circumstances, and again, with the disclaimer and the proviso that we didn't get to all of them, but even if under certain circumstances, opening up a store next to another one is, under those circumstances, okay, nonetheless, there are certain ethics and morals that come along with it. What I think, even in our short time here today, we'll get into some of the specifics maybe at the beginning next week, but what we've been able to, I think, underscore and emphasize in our short time here this afternoon is almost a manifestation, a embodiment, a microcosm of what we've been discussing the last couple of weeks. Halacha seeks to strike a balance between being fair, on the one hand, right, but also being moral and ethical, right? You have a right to open a business, okay? You have a right to open a business, but not if it's overtly being a bad person, If you have to be moral, you have to be ethical, and that, right? It's lavar olav b'shnei lavin, right? As Chazal, the Midrash Rashi cited said, lavar olav b'shnei lavin. Regardless of whether what you do can technically be categorized as theft, there is a larger umbrella here called hasagas gvul, and hasagas gvul isn't necessarily about theft. Lavar olav b'shnei lavin. There are two planes here. There's the legal, juridical question. Have you stolen? Have you not stolen? That brings all sorts of different kind of ramifications. Then there's the other question, the moral question. Putting the legal question aside, are you doing something that's ethical? Are you doing something that's moral? That is kind of really what's at play here. And we'll just conclude with the comment, the Gemara that we read. We noted this Gemara already both weeks, now a third week. The comment of the Gemara at the end of Masechet Baba Basra in the name of Rabbi Lazar, who says, if you want to be a tzaddik, right? If you want to be a tzaddik, you want to be a righteous person, study Choshen Mishpat, study civil law. Okay? What does studying civil law have to do with being a tzaddik? Because latent in civil law is not just the do's and don'ts. It's not just the X's and the Y's. It's not just the dollars and the cents, but it's also this whole other question about being a good person. And the economic theory that halacha continues to project is moral, ethical responsibility. It's much more about how I have to act, right, to be a good person and a part of my community and an upstanding citizen, than it is about always trying to be, to level the playing field and to see. So the question of, can I open a store next to my friend's store? It's just as relevant to ask, well, am I doing the right thing? As it is, and this isn't like a commentary, this is halakha's telling me. It's just as important to ask the question, am I doing the right thing, as it is to ask, am I stealing from that person? Lavar olav b'shnei lavin. There are two planes on which we govern, on which we work here, right? The juridical, monetary, economic one, the legal one, and the moral, ethical kind of community issue of hasagas gvul, of yored le'umnos chavero. We'll get a little bit into some of the details at the beginning next week, and then we'll get into a discussion of rapo yirapeh, of providing health care, and whose responsibility is that, if anyone's at all. Okay?
Thank you.
Yes.
You're
You're very welcome.
What's
Yeah.
what's halacha's take on the big retail operations that at the end of the day provide a benefit to society by hiring people, by offering all sorts of goods?
That's a great question. You mean like the
Target,
the mega shops?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Now, part of it is a little bit outside the purview of this discussion because we don't live in a halachic society, and the people they hire wouldn't necessarily fall under the purview of being governed by halacha. So, the question of, can halacha limit the hiring of that type of store? Or would it even?
Right, but in Israel, chain stores.
Sure. So that's a good question. That's part of what I want to talk about. Part of the specifics that I want to talk about. Does the availability of jobs, for example, matter? It's always an important question. So gas prices are so low. That's such a wonderful thing. How many thousands of workers had to been fired in the oil companies because gas prices are so low? So in a capitalist and a free market economy, those kind of were being tugged in every direction in that sense. So which do we care most about? It's a good question. Yeah.
Are we holding those workers back because they're not union workers and they're not getting a good salary?
Yeah, what's the halachic status of unions? It's a good question.
All of that, so that's an issue too.
We only had a 4-part series. I wish we could discuss more. Maybe they'll invite me back to do.
Yes.
Yes,
Very
yes,
honored.
thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much, everybody. Looking forward to seeing you next week. And
Walmart.
Yeah.
There's no